Shall we get back to the sick note culture, so-called sick note culture that the Prime Minister was speaking about in that speech? Because we're going to talk to Darwin Friend. He's head of research at the Taxpayers Alliance. And they've got one or two things to say about this, because the Prime Minister was saying over the next 4 years, it's projected that the amount spent on what are known as personal independence payments could rise by 50%. Darwin, that's a huge potential liability for the taxpayer.
Yeah, good afternoon, Tom and Emma. Thank you very much for having me on the show. And it's a massive increase. And I think that's what we need to remember throughout all of this, is that this is a cost to taxpayers. And we're seeing a forecasted 2 million extra people going to be on disability benefit by the end of this decade, which is set to see the disability benefit bill rise by up to £17 billion. Now, that's a more than 50% increase. And so it's right that the Prime Minister wants to end this sick note culture so that then the costs on taxpayers are reduced.
I have to ask you, Darwin, so the suggestion from the Prime Minister is that instead of having the sick note signed off by GPs, there would be a certain professional position that would have the authority to sign off on these sick notes. Could this not potentially cost the taxpayer even more money? Because the GPs, obviously, you know, people get diagnoses for particular illnesses. It's very easy for them to sign it off. It's not going to yet another person who doesn't have those qualifications and having to have it signed off through them as well.
Yeah, and I think that's what the government really needs to pay attention to with these new people that are going to be reviewing this, is making sure that it's good value for money for taxpayers. I mean, at the minute, GPs, we're seeing there are around 11 million fit notes that were signed by them in England last year. 94% of those were signed off as not fit for work. And so whilst I do accept that it might be easier for GPs because they're also dealing with their medical conditions at the same time to do it, if the government is going to switch to a new body to review these things, then it needs to have at the core of that decision value for money for taxpayers, so that then any saving being made by GPs not doing that work isn't pretty much going up by other people doing it instead of them.
Did you say 94% of these notes are passed up? That's an extraordinary... That's a North Korean level of sort of election approval. I mean, am I right to be cynical here about the percentage of genuine sickness?
Darwin, is this because so many of these, I think it was just upwards of 50% of that increase since COVID is because of people who have mental health problems like anxiety, bad nerves, depression? Is the high level of approval of these requests for a sick note because something like mental health is so much more subjective than a physical ailment?
Yeah, so definitely post-pandemic mental health conditions have been a key part of this. And we're also seeing that, I believe, anxiety and depression are key factors for disability benefit recipients as well. But I also think that we need to pay attention throughout this as well, that the government needs to also get its own house in order regarding this. I mean, we've done work in the past on sickness absence in the public sector compared to the private sector. And every year since 1995, when data was first made available, sickness absence in the public sector has been significantly higher than that in the private sector. And so whilst I commend the Prime Minister for talking about this sick note culture in general, he also needs to make sure that his government is getting his own house in order so that the money, which is taxpayers after all, is being spent effectively and for their benefit.
Yeah, it doesn't quite add up, does it? That the public sector, which traditionally you sort of have more holiday, you have perhaps shorter working days than many private sector organisations, and yet there's greater amounts of mental ill health. But those two things that you'd think you'd perhaps expect less mental ill health with more time off and shorter working days and all the rest. But perhaps that does show a discrepancy there. Darwin Friend, I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but thank you so much for talking us through the implications here for taxpayers. That's Darwin Friend, Head of Research at the Taxpayers Alliance.